Okay, so it looks like our entry has kind of slowed down a little bit here. And I have some housekeeping things to go over first. So I think I'm just going to get started here because we have a packed webinar for everyone today. And I just want to confirm maybe some of my panelists, can you see my screen here with a nice intro slide?
It is looking excellent.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, well, we will get started. So I'm going to start with introducing myself. So my name is Holly Kinnis. I'm a conservation analyst at the Miistakis Institute. And I'm joined today for this webinar with our project partner, Noreen Ambrose from Cows and Fish, the Riparian Management Society. And then our guest speaker today, we're happy to welcome Dr. Cherie Westbrook from the University of Saskatchewan. So I want to start today just by acknowledging that we are gathering here in this space from all across Western Canada and beyond. We recognize and acknowledge the First Peoples and the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for thousands of years and countless generations. Today, I am located at the Miistakis Institute, well, at my home office, which is close to the Miistakis Institute office. And we're located in Miistakis, which is Calgary on Treaty 7 lands. And my co-presenters today are joining also from Treaty 7 and from Treaty 6 lands. So I just want to go over a few housekeeping items here. I think we're going to start off with a poll. So if my partners want to launch the poll, so we're going to ask you all two questions. So if you could let us know which best describes you and the hat that you're wearing today, joining from this webinar. And then if you could please kind of rate your understanding of beaver ecology, kind of the role and influence that they have on the landscape, challenges, management options. Prior to listening to this webinar, we're just kind of trying to get a sense of where you're coming from. So please remember to scroll down so you can answer both questions. And we'll just give you guys a few minutes to read through that. So we can just leave that up for a minute here while we get the last few, and I'll just keep going over the housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be posted on our YouTube channel following the webinar. The chat is enabled, but if you would like to answer a question or ask a question, we would like you to use the Q&A function if you can. The nice thing about the Q&A function is that you can view everyone else's questions. It kind of keeps it more organized for us to make sure we're answering all the questions. And then you can upvote other questions. So if you have the same question as someone else, you can just put a little thumbs up on it. And those questions with the most votes will kind of like raise to the top. But the chat is enabled. So if you're struggling with the Q&A function, you could always use the chat and we can move it over. Or if you're having tech issues, please let us know in the chat. And with the question and answer period, there is an option to sometimes answer them like written answers, but I think we're going to try our best to do a live answer of the questions. And that will take me to my agenda here. So our agenda today is pretty simple. We're going to quickly go over kind of what is working with beavers. So that's the project we're coming to you from. We're going to then invite Cherie to walk us through beavers and drought. And then we're going to save some time at the end for a question and answer period. Okay, so let's jump right into what is working with beavers. So our beaver project began in 2012. Working with Cows and Fish and the Anasandy Cross Conservation Area on a beaver restoration project. So from that project, we quickly learned that local land managers had a desire for coexistence solutions to help kind of address some of the beaver challenges that they were having, while still also maintaining beavers on the landscape and recognizing all the benefits that they provide. So our project has morphed and changed a little bit over the last 10 years. Today, our project is called Working with Beavers. It is a partnership project with the core team, which is the Miistakis Institute and Cows and Fish, the Riparian Management Society, as well as we have local partners we work with as well. So some examples are the Blood Tribe Land Management, Piikani Nation Lands Department, We work with other additional local partners such as municipalities. And these are on things like demonstration sites or hands-on workshops for installing coexistence tools. And we also deliver kind of awareness in those communities as well, such as like targeted webinars or in-person workshops. I would just like to take a second to thank our current funders. So the Alberta government's Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program, Alberta Innovates, the Calgary Foundation, and the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation. We have had numerous supporters over the years, and many of these programs have supported us over the past 10 years and are currently supporting us now. So the main goal of our Working with Beavers project is to really foster coexistence with beavers, to realize the ecological and watershed benefits that they have on the landscape. So we do this in several ways, including increasing knowledge and awareness and kind of in participation of activities that restore our watershed health and functions. We provide training for the implementation of coexistence tools. If you don't know what a coexistence tool is quite yet, we'll kind of be talking about that a little bit later on in the process. And we have a lot of great information on coexistence tools on our website as well. And then another facet of our beaver project is researching new tools and beneficial practices to beaver management. So one of the ways that we achieve these goals, as I mentioned, is creation of awareness materials. And we like to create these awareness materials specifically from scientific research. So they're backed by rigorous academic studies. For example, this is our cost-benefit analysis of beaver coexistence tools, and this was based on research that was done right here in Alberta. So we create fact sheets. We also create videos that kind of go over what some of the coexistence tools are, why landowners are interested in coexisting with beavers, and our various videos have had over 37,000 views on YouTube. Last year, we launched Beavers from Space, which was a citizen science initiative that was asking volunteers to search through satellite imagery from the Blood Tribe Reservation and surrounding areas, looking for dams and lodges on the landscape. So within 5 weeks, we had over 1,900 volunteers. We had 168,000 images classified and 31,000 subjects. So basically we had 30,000 images. Those were classified each by multiple people so that we could have the accuracy in that rating. And we're just in the process of analyzing the results from Beavers from Space. And we hope that this can kind of help inform some of our restoration efforts with regards to beaver dam analogs and beaver-mediated restoration. We have also undertaken literature reviews and social science surveys with various other types of research that can be found on our website as well. And we'll put the link up to our website at the end of our presentation, and you can check it out. But for now, I would like to pass it over to my partner, Noreen, who will take it from here.
So I'm hoping, yes, I'm hoping everybody is seeing the main screen, which is great. And as Holly said, one of the really important things we do is work on coexistence, because there are lots of challenges sometimes living with beavers. They aren't all great things that happen when we have beavers. Sometimes they cause us conflict, or we are in conflict with beavers. So we host a lot of workshops with participants learning how to install these kinds of techniques that you see on the screen. And that's things like culvert protectors, pond levelers, that are helping reduce things like flooding caused by beavers. And in learning these skills and properly understanding the techniques to make these most successful when they're implemented is key to creating a really important and valuable community of practice. So as more people know how to do these things and do them well, then obviously there'll be more success at addressing these kind of conflicts. We also use these same sites in most cases as demonstration sites. And so that is providing tours, showing people hands-on what they look like, what's been done, and undertaking long-term monitoring of these sites to then share learnings as we go along over time in our work across the province. And they're not always, of course, perfect. They don't always totally succeed. And of course, I'm hoping my screen seems to be having a lag, so I'm hoping it's switched for you now. Every demonstration site is unique. In the top left side, you see a pond leveler. On the far tall side on the right, you see a site from Barhead County, which is a culvert exclusion, and in the bottom left, there's a combination device. So every site's different, but they're all designed to address a beaver conflict and identify a solution that maintains or increases the benefits that beavers have while eliminating, hopefully, or mitigating the conflict or the problem, such as flooding due to a plug culvert. So not all of this work, of course, works perfectly the first time. So sometimes adjustments are needed and modifications. And that learning along the way with the local partners and ourselves is about what works and what doesn't work is really important to make it a good demonstration site. That's we're trying to demonstrate how to do things and sometimes how not to do things as well. And so then we can share that learning across the province. And this is a map that shows from the Working with Beavers website what we call the Beaver Coexistence Tools map. So you can go on here and check out many other sites that we have been involved in, as well as others have done, to learn what people have been doing, and you can upload your sites that you've done with Beaver Coexistence, so more people can learn. What to do or not to do in some cases. So I encourage you to check that on our website as well. The other thing we talked about already is about the importance of research and using things like the cost benefit analysis. We've developed a cost calculator on the website, particularly for municipalities. This is a great way to know when or how long would it take to pay off some of these other techniques, these coexistence techniques like a pond leveler. A lot of problem sites have to be revisited many times. So if you think about going out to a site with typical couple people unplugging culverts repeatedly over the summer without putting in these devices, how long would it take to pay that off? So if that's happening, usually it could be paid off within a month or two because these devices are very inexpensive and low tech. So those are just some things to check out on our website. Another piece of research and information has been helping identify where there is potential for restoration, and that's for things like beaver dam analogs, which I'll talk about in a minute, and how we've used a US-based GIS system, which has been then modified with Alberta data, called Drought, which is, as you see there, Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. And that basically helps identify where's their beaver dam capacity based on things like slope and vegetation. And so we've used that model for our work, but also for partners like Trout Unlimited Canada for some of their priority planning on restoration sites in streams. So here's what a beaver dam analog looks like, which I mentioned. One of the research and demonstration things we're doing is installing and following up on what do these sites do. So this is a low-tech restoration technique that's meant to mimic restoration of natural processes. So things that would happen in nature normally by mimicking a natural beaver dam, which is hand-built with normal natural materials on hand. So they can be used for a number of purposes, but they're often meant to provide natural stream restoration, which might include, and I'll just list them, reconnecting the floodplain and the channel. It might mean slowing the water to reduce erosion, or even increasing water storage behind it to hold water, obviously, and also increase storage of water in the floodplain in the shallow aquifer. So they've been also used in other places for stream restoration and fish habitat and population recovery, greater sage-grouse habitat improvement, and other purposes across North America. They often require a number of regulatory approvals, so because they are built-in stream channels. So it's important to understand that you can't just go out and put them in, obviously, in water bodies without those approvals. They can be used to encourage beavers to actually return to a site, but they can also be installed where there are no beavers or where you might not even have an intention that beavers are likely to return, at least not in the immediate future at all. But the ability to store water and recharge shallow groundwater in particular is why these techniques are so important to connect land and water and heal streams because of the processes happening. So this is an image. If you see the white arrow on the right-hand side, that is showing where some water is trapped. And so the installation happened which you could see in the prior slide, as well as on the left-hand side here. Pre-installation is a pretty dry spot. There's just a puddle of water here that's below a culvert outflow at a road. And the white arrow is showing after spring runoff that water is trapped behind this beaver dam analog, showing an important reason about why we're talking about beavers and drought today, because water is can be trapped and be one of the benefits that beavers provide us. On our website, another great recent release is the beneficial management practices work that we've been doing. And you can see this interactive tool is actually a decision tree. So you can go in and answer simple yes, no questions, and it directs you to choose between reactive or proactive options, coexistence solutions. And once you've decided what's a best fit to address the problem you have, then you click on that particular link or box, and it'll take you to more detail for that kind of technique and help you hopefully address the problem that you have. So moving on to our guest speaker, I want to welcome Cherie, who's going to talk a lot more about the role that beavers play in water and droughts. And so Cherie is joining us as from Saskatchewan. She is a professor of ecohydrology in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Saskatchewan, and also an affiliated member of the Center for Hydrology and Global Institute for Water Security. She earned her PhD in ecology and hydrology from Colorado State University after she completed her undergrad at the University of Toronto in environmental science, and her master's in environmental biology and ecology at the U of A here in Alberta. She's also done work with government and industry on hydrology, so she knows lots about water and also lots about beavers. She uses a combination of fieldwork, modeling, and remote sensing to understand how beaver ecosystem engineering, what beavers do, creates the slow flow that is critical for environments to build the climate resilience, reverse environmental degradation, and bolster biodiversity. So beavers having a lot of roles, but sometimes also conflicts. We are really happy to hear from Cherie about some of her research, and I'll encourage her to start sharing her screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Noreen. Thank you, Holly, for having me here. And thank you to everyone joining us. I am joining the webinar today from Beaver Creek in Territory 6, where I live. The introduction was very lovely, so I don't feel like I have to say much more about the kind of research I do, other than, we work on beaver themselves, but we work on some of the mimicry structures and also a little bit on beaver mitigations. And our science is supposed to help underpin effective management practices and also, water conservation and future water supplies for other generations. And so as a researcher, it's my job to answer questions. I mean, that's what I get to do. It's pretty fun. And the question that I wanted to talk about today is, how do beaver actually do the drought proofing of ecosystems? This is such an important aspect of the kinds of functions that beaver have in landscapes. And so I wanted to kind of get into some of the nitty gritty of how they actually go about doing that. So as probably everyone knows, according to the poll earlier, beavers are herbivores. They like to cut down woody plant material like this aspen in Kananaskis country, and they transport these, they section them and they transport woody material to streams, rivers, wetlands, lakes, and any other water body that they might be living in. The beavers are a semi-aquatic animal, and they need to be mostly in aquatic environments to provide protection from predators. They eat a variety of other types of things other than woody plants, but what is really important because it helps them with some of their ecosystem engineering activities. And so this is also in Kananaskis. This is the site I have worked at for about 20 years now. It is Bateman Creek. And what you can see here is a beaver swimming around in the pond that it has created because of this lovely dam. These beavers, though, they do much more than build dams. They dredge canals, they pile sediment in various places across the landscape. They dig out soils, they build lodges, and they actually consume some of that woody material. There's lots of ecosystem engineering functions that beaver can contribute that could offer drought protection. I guess what I'm arguing today is that the dams are the key to creating these slow flow environments. And so that's what we're going to focus on. I think canals too are probably quite important, but we have much more limited research on them. All right, so how do beavers actually build dams, and where do they do this? Well, I think what's in most of our mind's eye is that beaver will come and build a dam out of wood and sticks and mud and potentially rocks in flowing environments like rivers. And that's pictured on the left-hand side, also in Kananaskis country. And you can see that they have created a complex network of these dams, shown with the squiggly black lines, and created surface flooding. And the arrows kind of show us how all that water is moving through this complex mosaic. And that happens in lots of places. One family of beavers would be living at this site. One of the sites that we're working at has 32 dams built and maintained by one beaver family. So it's not that a beaver family comes in and builds just one dam. They're usually building a multitude of them, so a complex or a network. The other thing that beavers can do is they have excellent digging skills, and they can excavate soil, pile it into berms, and therefore dam groundwater seepage. So the kind of groundwater, the surface waters we see pictured on the right-hand side here is actually a result, a part of building the dams, but really the beaver excavating, piloting it into these berms, adding some sticks for reinforcement, kind of like you would have rebar and concrete, and building a number of these in environments. And these dams may or may not be connected eventually by a flowing stream. You can see kind of on this right-hand picture at the top of the flow sequence, there are some clear surface water connections, but other ponds look very isolated and are connected by the groundwater system. And so I thought I'd show just a photograph that we've captured last summer of how beavers are just very important in excavating soil, and they can excavate extremely large volumes of soil. So building dams has a whole range of hydrological impacts in ecosystems. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is that the beaver dam creates a pond. So they how much water is stored in the surface water system. And so in the past, we went across Kananaskis country in an area equally sized north of Kananaskis country and surveyed all of the wetlands that are existing in that area. And of all of those wetlands, we looked at how many of them had beaver. And it was about 30% of these wetlands had beaver in them. And so that amounted to just under 170 ponds, peatlands. And then in those peatlands, we looked at how many beaver ponds were occurring. And it was a lot more than one per peatland. So there were 782 beaver ponds, and each pond on average, each peatland in average had about 0.4 hectares more open water than peatlands that did not have beaver. So I think that's pretty clear evidence that beaver are creating open water bodies in peatlands. So then we came to the problem of figuring out, well, how much water is that being stored? And this seems like a simple idea, right? There's a pond there, you can figure out how much water's in it, but it's actually not as simple as it seems. So what we did is borrow some work that had been done in the prairies on prairie pothole wetlands and look to see if beaver ponds could, have the same kind of water storage relationships that pothole wetlands do. Okay, so the challenge is that a beaver, when it is building a dam on a stream, has kind of a uniform pond bed. So you can see the little pictures of the beaver dams on the left-hand side. And if you look to the one that's farthest to the right, that's kind of what you'd expect on a stream, is beaver would build a kind of semicircular type dam, and the pond would be kind of full of water fairly uniformly across its spatial extent. The ponds on the left-hand side are a little different. So these are built on peatland surfaces. So they are ponds that are dams that are damming groundwater seepage. And you see a much more varied kind of amount of water in them, from places where there's none to places where the water is really deep. And what our research showed by investigating very carefully the bottom elevation, the bathymetry of beaver ponds, is that we can actually consider ponds as bowls, just bowls of different sizes, and use that to estimate how much water is in them and do that within about 5% of what's actually in them. And so what we came up with was a coefficient that tells us about the shape of that bowl. So the value is P, is the coefficient. And some P values indicate that the bowl is really like a deep, narrow type shape. And some tell us that the pond is more like a flat plate. And despite those shapes, if we know a little bit about the bathymetry of the ponds, we can estimate that water storage very readily. All right, so our dam structure also indicates how much water there is stored in the ponds and how much the stream flow is actually slowed. So this is kind of a side view of a beaver dam, a stylized beaver dam, where flow is going from the left side of your screen to the right side of the screen. And one of the characteristic things about beaver dams is they create a stair-step profile to the stream, right? So on the upstream side of a beaver dam, the water level is usually deeper, and on the downstream side, the water is usually much shallower. And what this does is it creates a hydraulic gradient, so a water level difference that we have marked here as the delta H, the triangle H. Okay. And so it's this value of how much the water level is raised on the upstream side that determines how much water can be stored in the pond and also how much flow regulation we might expect to see downstream. And so let's do an example. This is actually from Belgium because I thought it would be fun to go to Europe for a day. Okay, so this is the stream flow, and the variable we use to describe that is discharge. And this is for a time sequence in 2009 from Nison's work. And the blue line is the water flowing into the beaver pond, and the orange line is the water flowing out of the beaver pond. And we can see that those two lines look quite different. Okay, so every time the stream, every time there's a rainstorm occurring in the system, the blue line comes to a peak. It raises up, we get an increase in stream flow through the system, and then it's, the storm passes and the stream returns back to a lower discharge amount. What happens when you have the beaver pond there, though, is that water becomes stored in that beaver pond and much more slowly released from it. And we'll talk about the reasons why in just a second. But so if we look to the far right, where it says reduce size of peaks, you can see that the stream discharge into the beaver pond was about 5 cubic meters a second, and the discharge out of the beaver pond was only about 1 cubic meter per second. So beavers reduce the impact of floods. But we're here to talk about droughts, so we have to talk about what happens in the low flow conditions. And so if we look just left of what we were just looking at, we can see the increase in discharge in low flow conditions. And here the orange line is above the blue line in the times when there's not very much water in the stream. And that happens very consistently over this time series. And that is part of what beaver are creating as drought proofing the system, is that they're slowly releasing the water from the ponds during low flow conditions. So when there's no beaver pond, water is moving more quickly through the system. All right, so let's look a little bit beyond ponds and go visit Colorado for a minute. And there I was looking at beaver dams on the main stem of the Colorado River in the headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side. There was one beaver dam that was built in the valley. And what we did see is that the ponds were formed upstream of beaver dams. And that's the dark blue shaded area, okay? But there's also a lighter blue shaded area or brighter blue shaded area. And that was the amount of surface flooding that was created by just that one pond. So that one beaver dam was able to divert 70% of the flow in the Colorado River onto the floodplain and onto really old floodplains, and move that water slower down valley and back to the Colorado River at a distance of about 1 kilometer downstream. So this is part of what is causing that increased flow during low flow times, is that a beaver dam is storing the water and moving it across the surface, and it takes more time than moving the water straight down through the channel. That work also showed that the orientation of the dam is more important than the dam dimensions. And so to illustrate, we have this situation I just showed on the left-hand side. So we have that beaver dam that I was just talking about was actually almost 2 meters tall and was 30 meters in length. It created just a small pond, 0.1 hectares, and it flooded a large amount of the valley bottom at 8.7 hectares. Let's compare that. So the Colorado River here is the channel through the main part here, and the dotted line is the edge of the valley. And water is flowing from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. So let's look on the right-hand side. So if we put the dam now on a portion of the stream that's oriented differently to the valley, right? So it's kind of moving across the valley instead of this moving across the valley at that point instead of downstream. We can put a much smaller dam, one that is about 1 meter less in height, and a much shorter dam. It's only 8 meters tall. That creates a pond of about the same amount of area, 0.2 hectares, but it flooded a much larger area, 12 hectares. And we estimated about 90% of the volume of the Colorado River was pushed onto the floodplain and flowed across the floodplain and back to the stream, up to 1.5 kilometers downstream. Okay, so beavers do not just have effects on how water is moving about the surface. They impact how water is moving below the surface and in the groundwater system. And this graph shows work from Ann and Sandy Cross Conservation Area, where we were looking at daily water table. That's what's on the y-axis, the vertical axis, across just the summer period. So normally in the system, we see a decline in the water table. So it drops over the summer, and we get these dry conditions. And we have 3 different lines here, and they're really thick because they represent different parts of ponds. Okay, so the top line in kind of that bluey purple is adjacent to a flooded beaver pond. And that would be in areas where it was flooded deep or flooded not too shallowly. So you can see that the water table is close to the surface. It's at 0. It's not very far down below the ground. And only in the late summer declines to maybe 20, 30 centimeters below ground. So really still very accessible to plant roots. In the unimpacted parts of the site, the unimpacted by beaver that is, that's the green line, you can see that the water table is more than 80 centimeters below the ground surface for the entire period of record here. And interestingly, we decided to put in some monitoring devices in a beaver pond that was abandoned, and the dam was partially breached. And we were surprised to see that the pond was actually still effectively increasing the water table by quite a lot, actually. So the water tables were not as high as in the flooded beaver pond, but they certainly weren't as low as the places where there were no beaver dams. They were kind of right in the middle. This is a water table depth that is accessible to plant roots. And so I wanted to highlight that, abandoned site for a moment. After we saw those results and we were seeing them again and again, year to year, we decided to look across Kananaskis area to see what was going on. And so I have a couple pictures here of ponds of different ages. None of these sites have beaver any longer as of 2023 or 2022. I've been to all of these sites since 2022. And we know when some of the sites were abandoned with beavers. So the one in the top left was abandoned in 2013 after the flood. And beaver have not yet returned to this pond, yet that pond continues to hold some water and influence the groundwater near it. The pond at the bottom was active for quite a long time, between 1948 and sometime in the late 90s. I just don't have the exact date. And it was abandoned before I started working at the site in 2006, and it has not had beaver in it since, yet it's still holding water. And then this exciting find of mine, also in Kananaskis country, as there's a series of ponds near the University of Calgary field station that I've been able to date back to formation in around 1936. They currently do not have beaver in them, but they are all holding water. Okay, so it leads me to talk about what is the groundwater footprint of a beaver dam. So in investigating water levels across these wetland environments over and over and over between years, wet and dry years, we were able to discern that at least in Kananaskis, the zone of the elevated water table is about 150 meters around a beaver dam. And that doesn't sound like a lot until you consider the idea that, you know, one beaver colony, one beaver family might be building upwards of 30 or more beaver dams in a particular area. And so exactly how much is that? Let's like try to conceive that. So accounting for the different kinds of soils that there are, seeing a rise in the water table of about 13 centimeters, which is what we've been documenting in Kananaskis, for a footprint of 150 meters, leads to an additional water storage of about 16.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth. So that's actually quite a bit of water by raising the water table just a little bit. Okay, so how does this exactly happen? Well, when beaver are building these dams, they're creating that stair-step profile in the stream, like you can see in the picture on the right. And we used all this plumbing pipe to tell us about how water is moving down the stream, but underneath of it, and between the stream and the stream banks. And what we were able to figure out is that by raising the stream level, what happens is that the pressures on the stream are no longer, the forces are no longer in the downstream direction. They shift, they change. And to keep the dam from failing, the pressures actually move and the force moves toward the banks. And that causes water to infiltrate from the pond into the stream banks and away from the stream. Now that influence only happens for a few meters outside of a beaver pond. And so that water will loop around the beaver pond and underneath of it, so in these 3 dimensions, and flow back to the stream through the groundwater system. So how does this drought proof? Well, it's much slower of a water flow path to flow through soil. You gotta, your water's gotta avoid all of these little soil particles as it's flowing under and around and looping through the system. And so that's a much slower pathway than going directly down the stream. So this picture is looking downstream toward 2 beaver ponds adjacent to one another. And what beavers are doing is building dams that aren't necessarily straight. They kind of build them in this semicircular type form. And that's an idealized mathematical form to distribute pressure across the system. And so water is actually flowing into the banks and into the ground all around that dam in quite an equal kind of way because of the orientation of the dams. Okay, the second way that beavers are creating the drought proofing is that the dams, because they have a high water level, they are trapping water in them. What we see over the winter time is seepage into the groundwater system. And I shouldn't say that just happens in the winter time. It's the time we can quantify what's actually going on. And the reason why we can quantify what's going on in the winter is because the water balance becomes very simple. Okay? The amount of change of water stored in the beaver ponds becomes a function of simply vertical losses in the system because everything else is frozen. In the summer, you've got to worry about evaporation and a whole bunch of other processes. So what we did is put a pressure transducer, that's a sensor we use to measure water levels, into beaver ponds under the ice. And you can see in this graph here of pond water level depth that it declines over the winter period. And so we were able to calculate the rate that that water level is declining, and that would be that seepage into the groundwater system. And we noticed that it was somewhere between 8 and 10 millimeters of flow per day. So quite a bit of water moving from the surface water system now into the groundwater system, where it can flow back to the stream slower than it would in the spring across the land surface. All right, so that kind of raised this question for us is, why is water seeping into the pond beds? Okay, so from a physics perspective, it makes sense. You pile a bunch of water on the land surface and you increase the pressure and the downward forces, and so water moves down into the bed. But we wanted to explore it a little bit further, and we were thinking about carbon. And so on the left-hand side, you kind of see a stylized pond, let's call it a beaver pond, and you have your wetland surface saturated with water, okay? When you do that, when you flood a wetland surface, you actually change how much oxygen is available in the soils beneath. So you greatly reduce that, and you can have emission of carbon as methane. So you can get these bubbles forming. If you've ever stood at a pond and watched bubbles move upward, that is methane raised to the atmosphere from the underlying soils. And so this is a well-known process. We've monitored it in Argentina's beaver ponds, and lots of people have documented that methane release happens when you flood a wetland. What that effectively does, though, is change how much carbon content there is in the soils lying beneath the beaver pond. And that's what we were interested in. Not so much how much methane was being released to the atmosphere, but what was how that was causing a change in the soils below. And so what we did was explore how much organic matter there is in the peat soils beneath beaver ponds compared to parts of peatlands without any beavers. And that's the graph on the left. And so the pink is the undisturbed peat surface, no beaver ponds, and the pond meadow in blue is where there are beaver ponds. And we can see that there is a large reduction of about 30% of the carbon content of the peat in beaver pond sediments. And why that matters to this leaky pond bottom situation is that changes the hydraulic properties of peat. It changes how permeable the soils are. And so hydraulic conductivity, which is shown on the right-hand side, is simply a measure of the ease at which water can flow through soil. And so higher values mean water can flow more easily. You can see the dark blue bars are the beaver pond at two different depths, shallow and deeper on the right-hand side. And in both of those cases, all the way down past 50 centimeters below the pond bed surface, we are seeing higher hydraulic conductivity. And so this groundwater seepage is in part related to beavers coming in, flooding wetland surfaces, changing the soil structure to make it actually better for storing water. So they're changing the partitioning of water between the surface water system and the groundwater system. All right, so let's bring that all back to drought, okay? So I pulled the recent information from the government of Alberta on its current conditions. So the March snowpack survey results were better in terms of water availability than they were in February. So in February, there was a lot of dire news that many places where we're monitoring snow accumulation showed that we were at maybe 30% snowpack. And then, of course, we had some large storms come through the first weekend in March. And that has alleviated some of the deficits in snowpack at some places, but there are still many places with very low snowpack. So in the Oldman River Basin, 2 of the 7 surveyed locations are 80 millimeters below the normal. In the Bow River Basin, 14 of the 21 locations surveyed are below normal at the moment, and only 1 of the 3 sites in the North Saskatchewan River Basin are below normal. And I think what this suggests is that we really need to think about working with beavers in order to help provide that drought resiliency in the system. The more beavers we have, the more natural infrastructure we have, which I think complements our engineered structure solutions in this province, and will help us slow the flow through the system and provide it when people need water for various land uses later in the summer. So I think that's all I have for now. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Cherie. I know I learned a lot during your presentation as well. It's great to see some of the research that you've been working on. Just going to share my screen here. I'm just going to share just our contact information slide. So if anyone has questions that aren't answered during the question and answer period, or you want to follow up with us afterwards, here is our contact information. So I'll maybe just leave that up for a minute or two here. But I think we can probably get started with the question and answer. Noreen, did you maybe want to look at the first question here?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that didn't already see it, there are in the Q&A session, you'll see a few questions were already answered just by typing them in during the day. So do have a look in that section if you didn't already see that. But the first question is, are you looking at beaver mimicry as well? And so for those that aren't familiar, beaver mimicry is doing things that mimic what beavers would do in nature in simple terms. And so really the beaver dam analog work that I talked about is really beaver mimicry essentially. So trying to mimic what beavers do and build fake beaver dams, really. So that is one of the things we are doing out and trying to monitor that. But Cherie, is there anything that you do that you'd want to add in terms of that's related to beaver mimicry?
I think, my role as a scientist at a university is to explore kind of the how and why and how effective that these structures are, and so that I can provide guidance to others. And the work that we've been doing is studying some of the beaver dam analogs that we put in and in Sandy Cross. And I actually have a large project just getting underway in Rocky Mountain National Park where they have lost their beaver. And we are putting in beaver dam analogs this summer in various geometries and studying how that impacts the resources there.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And there are so many connections to different elements that you don't know until you start to research them. So the next question, and then I'll pass it back to Holly. I think this question would be for Cherie from a question about water monitoring and hydrology. So when you look at and are trying to evaluate the water level upstream of a dam versus downstream, to understand how much water is being held back or how much flow is slowed down, do you have to measure immediately upstream of that single dam and downstream of the dam, or can you kind of, if they're in sequence, put your monitoring at the uppermost dam, let's say, and the other monitoring piece at the lowermost dam, or some other way?
Well, I think, that's a great question, because the how and where and why to do all of these things is something we don't talk enough about. I think it really depends on what your goals of your study are. So we do both. We monitor up and downstream of dams and up and downstream of sequences of dams. And sometimes those dams are not in a logically easy to see sequence, and we're trying to figure out what the actual sequence of flow is. So, I mean, if you're wanting to know how much water resources there are downstream in the sequence, really, I think you need to just look upstream and then at the downstream point of the sequence. We're looking at more of the details in the sequence because we're trying to understand how each part of the sequence is functioning and whether there's any, I guess, gatekeepers of water in the system, some really important gatekeeping type beaver dams, or whether they are all functioning the same way.
All right, perfect. And I'm going to stop sharing here so that you guys can see our faces a little closer up here for the question answer period. Okay, so we have a question here from Nancy, and this would probably be for Cherie as well. Now, of course, this is a long word for a afternoon webinar. Does methanogenesis taper after dam construction or remain consistent through the life of the dam and or each open water season?
I think this is a great question, and I don't think we have the answer yet in a lot of detail. I also think it depends where we are. There's quite a bit of research going on and trying to understand that better. Beaver ponds, kind of the early work that was done just showed that this process was happening and that beaver ponds may be important in the global climate cycle. But it didn't really look very carefully at different ages of ponds following through the whole growing season and into the fall, or even looking at the annual balance of that. So I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
To be determined. Okay.
To be determined. Yeah.
Maybe just to, you talked about peat wetlands. With that, is the story the same of what we do know in terms of methanogenesis, so that release of methane in non-peat? So thinking prairie pothole regions that are mineral based, is the answer the same or the impact the same of beavers?
The impact is a little bit different, but the same kinds of processes are at play. And there is carbon, of course, in the ponds, in the prairie potholes. So really looking at methanogenesis is about looking at kind of the overall balance of carbon and when it's being stored, when it's being released, and the relative amounts. So the soils in the prairies are not quite as carbon rich as a peatland would be, of course, which is like 90% carbon. So the impact is a little bit smaller, but not insignificant in that region.
Great. And this next question is probably for you, Cherie, but Holly, feel free to jump in if you wish as well. What are the various reasons that beavers abandon a previously inhabited area? And they've said, I assume water and food are obviously some of those factors.
Yeah, I think the most important is going to be the food, because beaver can help manipulate the water availability. But certainly they do eat themselves out of house and home, and they do need to move on to other sites. And so the impact of beavers is going to, like, they're going to move around that landscape, and they might to that site over time, because the kinds of cuttings that they do and the kinds of plants that they cut the plants are adapted to that in North America. And so that basically what happens is that the plants regrow and the site becomes suitable for beaver at some point in the future. That doesn't happen where beaver are invasive, like in southern South America. They actually just simply eat themselves at house and home and have to move on because the plants aren't adapted to herbivory. But things like aspen and willow are very well adapted and will resprout readily.
Yep, perfect. I have nothing to add to that one. But on the same kind of line of topic about vegetation, we had a question. So is there any research into whether there is increased carbon capture by more vegetation able to grow with a rise in water table?
Yes. I feel like I'm answering all the questions. Okay. So one of my PhD students, Nicole Stoll, is actually looking at this very question, and we have some preliminary results. She's using drones to look at how raising the water table affects the greenness of plants, so their life cycle, and how productive the plants become too. So we have the preliminary results on the life cycle component, and it seems that adding water to the system by beaver dams to increase the greenness of plants late into the growing season. And what she's trying to do right now is link that to biomass. So we should have calculations on that within about 6 months. Yeah, I know. She's doing a great PhD.
Perfect. That's exciting research to come. I think what we're going to do, recognizing that it is 1 o'clock here and some people might need to run to other meetings, we're going to launch kind of our conclusion poll. And then I think, Cherie, if you have time just for a few more questions, we can maybe go 5 or so minutes after 1 o'clock.
For sure.
Perfect. Okay, so the poll is there. It looks like there's 2 questions in it. So we've launched that. We'd appreciate everyone's feedback. We'll give you a minute here to answer that as we read through some more of your questions. Okay, well, it looks like we're getting pretty good response to that. Maybe I'll jump to the next question here, and maybe I'll throw this one over to you, Noreen. So this person asks, I see the benefit of having the dams, but the amount of trees taken by beavers is overwhelming for the small amount of trees that we have. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, it can be really frustrating or disheartening, and when you've really, especially if you've been working hard to have or encourage tree and woody growth along streams and rivers, because that's an integral part of holding many of our streams and rivers together, the shore and the bank protection and habitat. To Cherie's point, I mean, these species did evolve together with poplars and willows, which are the dominant species along a lot of our waterways, in certainly the Great Plains in North America in general, but certainly in Alberta. So it is kind of like about a time and sequence. It's like thinking about the scale at which the natural ecosystem lives. Sometimes that doesn't work so great when you only own a small piece of it and you don't have a lot of time, because the beavers will ebb and flow and move from place to place as they eat themselves out of house and home temporarily. But that is hard to deal with. There are certainly tree wrapping solutions if you have prize trees and it's not a more natural extensive situation. There are other kinds of deterrent. Part of those coexistence techniques is how do you address that. I would say the other thing is a really big thing we've realized is that people think that cutting trees is actually bad, but it is part of the natural ecosystem. So also sort of shifting our understanding that trees have always been cut by beavers, and that's just part of the natural process. The bad part might be that we have very few trees left in a lot of the landscape due to our cumulative long-term changes, due to land clearing, due to maybe poorly managed grazing or bulldozing for development, or so we have less trees and shrubs available than would otherwise have been, and also loss of beavers long term actually has reduced the number of trees, which might seem counterintuitive, but more beaver dominated areas actually typically have more woody plants because they've created those zones of influence that are broader. And so by having less beavers, we actually have less trees in addition to less water, which Cherie talked about. In general, that's not true in all cases, obviously. So yeah, it's not an easy solution, but I think it's kind of working with our neighbors and in a community level is actually really important to say, how do we collectively manage and address these things together? And it's partly about beavers, but it's also about other land uses. How do we manage and build our roads and think about how to, create things that don't create conflict in the future for our beaver coexistence, or manage our grazing or urban areas in ways that are not sort of setting us up for problems. For instance, in urban areas, they're planting trees that are less palatable to beavers, for instance, things like that. So I hope that answers. It's not a perfect solution, for sure, because we're living on a modified landscape already too that's missing many of the trees that would have probably been along our streams and water bodies. So yeah, I think I'll take the poll down. I think everybody has had a chance to fill it in, and I'll just comment on the poll that one of the things we do with these things is use them to help report to our funders, because all of the work we do is funded by grants. And so it's really important, and we really appreciate getting feedback in addition to you attending, so that we can comment on the impact and value of these sessions like today. So I think we're going to continue with a few more questions. And
yeah, a few more questions here.
yeah.
I can jump in here, and I might jump around. We might jump around these questions a little bit because there's more than we'll be able to answer in allotted time. But this question kind of resonates with a question that I often get asked. So the question is there a concern with mainstream hydro facilities losing water to beaver work? And just kind of as like a second part on maybe a smaller scale to that question, with some of our BDA work, we quite often get the question or maybe misconception that, you know, if a beaver's upstream, they're like hoarding or stealing water from downstream users. So I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts on those two items. Cherie, I'll start with Cherie.
Okay. You know, I think there are real risks to beaver. I don't want to pretend that there aren't. I'm not sure that this is one of those risks. So one of the risks, of course, is tree cutting, especially of highly valued species and highly valued trees. And Noreen talked about ways that we could mitigate that. What beaver are doing is living more so in the headwaters than the mainstream in terms of where they're building dams. Of course, they can live in the mainstream of large rivers, right? They live in the city of Calgary, for example, the city of Saskatchewan on the river, but they're not building dams in those environments. And so beavers aren't stealing the water, they're redistributing it over time. And so I would say that what they're doing is stabilizing the hydrograph a little bit more, sort of like a human-built dam would, but just at a different scale. So yes, in low flow kind of years, there might need to be an evaluation and accounting of how much change in the overall main stem water there might be available where hydro facilities are located. But I'm going to guess it's a fairly small percentage of water in those downstream environments. Did I miss part of the question? Okay.
Yeah, there's lots more questions. So I'm going to try to maybe summarize or combine a couple as you did, Holly. You know, one of the things is drought specific. So I think I want to include this question. If we experience significant drought, how does that impact populations of beavers and overall behavior? And would it actually increase the beavers that are frozen out, for instance? And I think, you know, related to that, tying it to our drought theme is, you know, how much water volume change can we expect beavers, let's say, across the landscape, if they are doing a thing to really do? You talked about it at an individual site level, so 16.5 pools, but kind of across a large watershed or across the province, like how much impact could they have, and therefore also if they're lost or die due to drought themselves.
So that 16.5 swimming pool number was for the headwaters of the Bateman Creek, which flows into Jumping Pound Creek. So that was at like a 1.5 km scale area. So it's only going to be larger for larger areas. But again, beaver are mostly in these streams that are kind of fourth order and smaller than that. Climate change, I'm so glad that several people brought up this climate change aspect and how it might impact the beavers. And that includes that year to year or that kind of decade to decade drought versus deluge. And so some of our work from Riding Mountain National Park has been important in addressing this. So beavers themselves are affected by water availability, as several people have pointed out. In times that there's lower water availability, sites that have really permeable soils, like sandy soils, are going to more easily drain than sites underlined by clay. So I know, for example, in northern Alberta, places where beaver continue to live throughout drought periods are places with these finer grained soils because that assists with the water retention in the area. And then beaver are going to build dams to give themselves a bigger backyard, right? Being semi-aquatic animals, they want to live in these wetter environments. And so what we found through modeling work was that if you change the amount of high flows in a stream, it will have more of an impact than changing the lower levels of stream level, because the beavers can only build dams up to a certain flow rate of streams. We don't have the exact number, but at some point dams might breach, right? And so there's no ability for beavers to build anything that would last for any period of time. So they don't build dams in Calgary. And so if we have a climate that is changing the size of the really large flows, then we might expect to see reductions in the number of dams, which is what our modeling showed, or beaver moving to other sites with maybe not the best habitat, so more marginal habitats. Did I cover everything there?
I think so. So speaking of, you kind of mentioned like some urban, we delved into like city beavers. So in the urban environment, we do have a question specifically relating to that. So are there any study sites in urban areas where stormwater flows may impact the Q-in flow rate?
Yes, the work on that has been done in Pennsylvania by a colleague, Sarah Ledford. And she looks at urban areas mostly. She's an urban hydrologist. And I can't think of the answer to that specific part of the question, though. But I know she is working on these issues of trying to understand where beavers are living and how they're impacting flows, stream flows in urban environments. Sorry.
That's really neat.
There's so many different elements to this. So I want to do one more question, and then we're gonna wrap it up, because there are many more, and they keep coming in because we can't keep up. One question leads to another. So maybe I want to pick something that's a little bit different, and I maybe ask Holly to jump in, and I can comment on this because we haven't covered anything about permitting. So how and where are we getting to permitting to move beavers in Alberta? Do you want to jump in first, Holly?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So permitting to relocate beavers in the province is still kind of a bit of a struggle, I guess I could say. It's not easily or readily permitted. So permits do exist out there to relocate beavers. Of course, when you're talking about relocation of beavers, it's pretty complicated. You have a lot of factors involved, as like relating to disease, introducing a beaver to a new stream system where they might not have been before, territoriality of the beavers. There's a lot of moving pieces. And so right now, the province of Alberta doesn't really have like a blanket response to relocation. So permits are kind of assessed on a case-by-case basis. So there hasn't been a lot of progress made with the permitting for relocating beavers, although we are still, as our collaborative, we're still hearing a lot of requests for this. And we kind of try to keep track of our beaver matchmaking spreadsheet. So where people are saying, I would love some beavers, and other people are saying, I have some beavers I want to go to a good home. But right now that's not really happening on a larger scale in Alberta.
Yeah, and maybe for those that don't know, there's two permit types. One is research focused, so it has to have a very direct research element, and the other is let's say the general public might say, I have a problem beaver and I need to get rid of it, but I don't want to kill it, so I want it to move. So but it does, as Holly said, require a bit of paperwork, and it's not really something that's super easy, because most of these times they're urgent needs, or there's a conflict that's happening that, it's so, and there's not facilities to address disease. There's not a facility to trap the whole family and move the, say the mother and the babies at the same time, and store them until you have the group. And, so there's some protocol pieces too that don't exist in Alberta that actually do exist in other jurisdictions of relocation, best handling practices, like how do you actually transport the beavers, and ensure you're not putting it in an existing territory that some other beaver is just going to kill it because they are territorial, and things like that. So We're not doing any as a collaborative, directly moving any because of those various reasons, but we do get lots of requests, as Holly said, and ask for help. So those are the two mechanisms. I think we want to,
May I add to that?
yeah, do you want to add something to that, Cherie?
Yeah, I would. I think it's high time that we have a conversation in Alberta. And certainly all of us on this call would be happy to be part of that conversation about developing a provincial strategy for beavers and beaver management that goes much beyond just mitigations for the unwanted impacts of beavers. The whole Rockies Front Range is an area where there's much fewer beavers and beaver dams than the system can support. And then there are other places in the province that have an overabundance of beavers and challenges with industry. And so, if we want to look forward in time and be able to use this natural solution as part of the overall larger water and climate solution in the province, I think it would be really great if we could sit down and develop that kind of strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about droughts today and really thinking about how do we think long-term into the future, beavers being part of that solution. Yes, they also cause problems in places, but if we had a sound strategy provincially, those are ways to sort of mitigate and also have benefits at the same time. So we really thank you so much for speaking with us, Cherie, and staying on. And so many of the people that signed on today, you guys stayed on a really long time as well. So we really appreciate, hopefully you learned lots. We will try to maybe type out some of the answers that for questions we couldn't get to. And when we send out the link, because this is a recording, then you can tap into those as well. Anything you wanted to add, Holly?
No, I just wanted to thank Cherie again for joining us here today. It was great to have you present. I know, like I said, I learned a lot today. I'm sure many people on our call did as well. It's nice to see so many friendly faces in the call. So thank you for joining us and supporting our Beaver and Working with Beavers initiative. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.